The issue of Premier League all-time 11s has raised its head again. There was a bit of a debate on the Sports Social on Sky, I think it was, or the Saturday Social, where we saw, I think it was Bouvie, who's McCullough's mate, and Stumpeg, debated and argued about who they felt was the best Premier League 11 of all time. Now, a lot of people had a bit of a meltdown on this, saying, well, these two are too young to remember some of the early Premier League players and didn't watch them all and all that jazz. I don't want to get into their particular argument because I get that for them too, they're going to choose players they've watched. But it was interesting because it's not the only time where we see players from early on in the Premier League era getting almost ignored or dismissed when it comes to these kind of debates about which players deserve to be considered amongst the Premier League's greatest. And it especially comes to players at Manchester United, because obviously Manchester United in the 90s were pretty dominant. We won title after title. It was quite rare for Manchester United not to win a title, and obviously it culminated in 1999 with that historic treble win. But I often find that when I'm watching pundits or even some ex-players as well, and certainly the YouTube generation of which I'm kind of a part of, even though I'm a bit older, discussing all-time Premier League greats, it's very often that you see some players ignored from the sort of 92-93 season up to the end of the 90s as well, to be honest with you. And I was looking at it the other day and I was watching a debate about the greatest ever Premier League defender, and you hear the usual suspects come up: Rio Ferdinand, rightly so; Nemanja Vidic, again, can't argue with that one; Virgil van Dijk, not my personal pick, but I get why he's in the conversation; John Terry, really, but again, I get it. But you never hear many people suggesting someone like Gary Pallister, for example, as even in the conversation. I'm not saying Gary Pallister is the greatest defender the Premier League's ever seen, but I think he deserves to be mentioned alongside the others, because look at his achievements, look at some of the records he broke, and it's funny that he never even gets mentioned. This is a player, of course, who won, I think, 4 Premier League titles. I think he was in the Premier League Team of the Year 4 times as well. And also, you remember when John Terry went an entire season playing every minute in a Premier League winning side? He was the first player to do that since Gary Pallister. Gary Pallister did that, I think in 92-93. He played every minute of every game in a 42-game season. That's pretty remarkable, not to miss a minute of any of the games whilst winning a title. In fact, he almost did it back-to-back. The following season, I think he played 41 out of 42 games in a title-winning season. Playing 83 games out of 84 in back-to-back title-winning campaigns is phenomenal. And Gary Pallister was an amazing defender. I watched Gary Pallister. It's a shame as well, because I think he won PFA Player of the year before the Premier League started, which obviously doesn't count, but shows you how good he was. And the fact that he was playing all those minutes, playing so well as well, just indicates what a great player he was. And he's never really in that conversation, but a lot of fans and people who watched him would put him in that conversation. I think some of the issue you have is a lot of these discussions, debates amongst people that weren't watching the Premier League in 92-93. Don't forget as well, early Premier League era wasn't always on the telly. It wasn't going online and watching matches wasn't a thing. So people often ignore it, or they just look at stats. And sometimes it's when you look at stats that you tend to ignore other players as well. The debate around the greatest midfielder or one of the best midfielders in the Premier League seems to centre often around the likes of Steven Gerrard, Paul Scholes, and Frank Lampard, Roy Keane's thrown in there. But then people start pivoting towards stats and they go, oh, well, Paul Scholes only got 55 Premier League assists or whatever it is. He only scored 107 Premier League goals. That doesn't take into context some of his achievements and the type of player he was. He wasn't always someone who was scoring loads of goals, or that was what he's in the team to do. Especially latter-day Paul Scholes, where he was more of a quarterback. He was dictating the pace of the game. He was spraying passes here, there and everywhere. So it wasn't just about goals and assists, but that often gets ignored. Also, what gets ignored is how many titles he won. Even when he was on the overlap next to Jamie Carragher. Jamie Carragher got it wrong. I think he thought he'd won 7. He's won 11.
He only won 2 Premier Leagues. It wasn't like he won 6 or 7 like yourself. So we've always put him as, right, I think once you've won it once or twice.
6 or 7.
What did you win?
11.
Oh.
Now, someone like Steven Gerrard, who's won 0, who's won as many Premier League titles as me and you, gets spoken about as being the greatest Premier League midfielder ever when he's won 11 less titles, or fewer, than Paul Scholes. Make it make sense, as the kids say. In fact, the only time Steven Gerrard effectively had a say in a title race was when he cost Liverpool the title. It's just bizarre that you always see him mentioned above someone like Scholes here. And again, I think part of the problem is a lot of Scholes' best games, or a big part of Scholes' era in the Premier League, was early doors. So people didn't watch it as much then, or certainly some of the younger fans didn't see those games. So they just go to stats. And if you want to talk about stats, then let's talk about the amount of titles he's won. You don't win 11 Premier League titles just by turning up or just by putting on a United shirt. You have to be an excellent player, and that is what Paul Scholes was, one of the true iconic and all-time greats we've ever seen. Talking of Premier League titles as well, Gary Neville's another one who gets dismissed. And a lot of that is because of himself. He always dismisses himself as, I was just this kind of player who, I was in a great team, I wasn't that good. And then people start saying, well, he was never anywhere near as good as Kyle Walker or Reece James or someone like that. Yeah, Gary Neville, I think, is he third in a list of the most Premier League titles, something like that? You don't win title after title after title over a 20-year period, or I think it was about a 12 or 13-year period in Gary Neville's case, if you're not an amazing footballer, if you're not a fantastic defender and a fantastic fullback. And that was what he was. And he links up with anyone. He could link up with anyone on that right-hand side. He was a phenomenal defender, and he almost gets dismissed as someone who was just a bit lucky. And part of that is because he does it himself. He's very humble, and he doesn't sort of brag and say, I was the greatest ever. So then people say, well, Trent Alexander-Arnold is a better player than Gary Neville ever was. He's a different player than Gary Neville ever was. And also Gary Neville was a better defender. If you don't believe that, go and watch the Champions League final when Real Madrid beat Liverpool. What was Vinicius Jr. doing? He was doing whatever he wanted because Trent Alexander-Arnold had forgot he was there. So sometimes people just want to ignore the early era. Sometimes the players themselves dismiss it, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes players actually point out the fact that they should have got their flowers, that people are almost disrespectful towards them and their achievements. Now, Andy Cole is another one. Now, Andy Cole got to 50 Premier League goals, I think it was, for Newcastle, 50 goals for Newcastle in about 50 games, which is an amazing record. Now, I know it's not Manchester United, but he's a Manchester United player. When we spoke to Andy Cole a few years ago on this channel, we asked him about that, and he was pretty forthright about the way he was ignored and his achievements were ignored. And it often comes up, these records, when someone breaks them. And it was the case with Erling Haaland. He broke Andy Cole's record. And even then, people say, he's broke Shearer's record. Well, Alan Shearer and Andy Cole had the exact same record. The only difference was Andy Cole did it without taking penalties. Yet people was acting as though it was Erling Haaland had just broke Alan Shearer's record. And that's something that aggrieved Andy Cole a little bit. And I think he's another player that deserves a little bit more respect.
But like I said, everyone wants a question. Just like a lot of the records that are coming up now. As I sit here now, I didn't even know that majority of them, I'm either at the top or within the top three. But these records have only come out recently because people are going to get close to them and surpass them. So once people get close or surpass them, they ain't talking about me. Yeah. They're talking about the individual who surpassed them. And you turn around and say to yourself, is that the way it's supposed to be?
And one final one I'm going to add into the mix as well, when it comes to discussing about players that should have a little bit more respect for their achievements and should be in the conversations amongst the greatest ever Premier League players, is Eric Cantona. Now, I know amongst United fans, certainly Manchester United fans of a certain age, Eric Cantona is le god. We can't say enough good things about him, but he often gets almost ignored. When there's any discussion about the top strikers in the Premier League, people rightly mention Henry and Rooney, and maybe even you might throw in an Aguero or Ruud van Nistelrooy. Maybe now you'll talk about Erling Haaland. Not many people would talk about Eric Cantona, but look at what he achieved. Look at what he did. Not only did he score goals, and he did score goals, and I'll get to that in a minute, he won the Premier League every single season he played in it. He even won the First Division with Leeds the year before he started the Premier League. But he comes to Manchester United. He ends a 26-year wait for a title. His goals are vital to that, and his performances are vital to that. He then helps deliver a double, scoring 2 goals in the FA Cup final, by the way. Not that we're talking about the FA Cup. He then gets suspended. He comes back from his suspension. What does he do? He wins another double. Now, you might look at some of his seasons as well and think, actually, that surprises me, some of those stats. I think in 1995 to 96, he had 25 goal involvements in 30 games, which is phenomenal, but that doesn't even tell you the full story. I remember towards the end of that season, I listened to the radio once, the commentator said, Eric Cantona continues his one-man crusade to bring the title back to Old Trafford. And that's what it felt like. I think there was 5 times Manchester United won 1-0 where Eric Cantona scored the winner. There was even games like 3-2 away at Main Road, that's where Manchester City used to play, where of the 3 goals United scored, Eric Cantona scored one of them and set up the other 2. Let's not forget as well, in the final of the FA Cup against Liverpool, he scored the winner there too. He was just a big game player and also someone who could consistently score match-winning goals. A player that deserves to be in the conversation when we talk about all-time Premier League greats, as do many other Manchester United players. Don't get me started on Ryan Giggs and his 13 titles and how that just gets ignored. And if you want to talk about moral judgments, then okay, why are we talking about John Terry? That's another story for another day. Let's not get into it. I just feel there's often disrespect aimed at Manchester United players, certainly in the early era, and it even goes as far as the manager. Sir Alex Ferguson, a man who won 13 titles, a man that came to a club that had not won a Division 1 title or a Championship title since 1967 and delivered 13 of them. even he gets disrespected, with some people thinking, oh, he was just a bit lucky, he weren't that great, he just had good players. It's not even mean. Get a grip. He won his first title in 1993 and his last one in 2013. Phenomenal achievement by a phenomenal manager who was part of this great, great club of ours. And I think some of his players deserved a bit more respect as well. Get involved in the chat in the comments. Am I talking nonsense? Do players get the respect they deserve? Or because some of the younger generation didn't see them, do they get ignored? Let me know what you think. I've been Jay Motty. This has been a little video looking at some of the Manchester United players who have been a little bit disrespected. Thanks for watching.